Good afternoon, welcome back. I hope not everybody didn't eat too much so that you're going to fall asleep while we're talking, because we've got some great stuff going to happen here. So to get started, boy, now I can hear myself. At first, I couldn't hear it. First, we have James Taylor. He is the Vice President, External Relations, Senior Fellow for Environment and Energy Policy with the Heartland Institute. We have Ryan Yonk from the Strata Policy.
Strata Policy, yeah.
And he is the Executive Director and one of the founding members of that organization. And we have Senator Troy Balderson, and he is in the Ohio Senate. He was one of those people that left the House thinking that the Senate was where he wanted to be. Some of us who served in the House side still can't quite figure out why anybody would go to the Senate. No offense to the senators in the room. That's just how us House members all felt. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on their bios beyond that, because you have those in your packets. And what we're going to do is just move to more on a discussion phase, and we're going to just have some conversation up here on some different issues, and then we will join in with you on some Q&A. So be thinking about some of the things you might be hearing from us up here, and then issues, if we don't hit on something that you're interested in, be ready with those questions when we move to that part of the program today. This being the energy and environment section of the conversation, I would like to first start out with just kind of give a quick idea of where either your state or we are with Heartland on. I want to start more so not dealing this right away in fracking and that type of thing, but on the regulation side at the federal level. And one of the key things that we've all been entrenched with over the last few days has been the Pope visiting. And he had some particular issues that he thought he should bring up on energy issues. And I want to just hear a quick give and take on what is your thoughts on the Pope and his conversation that he's having here?
Well, I'll be happy to start. I've written a couple columns on this during the past week and given some interviews on the topic. The Pope, well, first of all, just in general, seems like a man whose heart is in the right place, and he's looking to improve the condition of humanity, especially people who are downtrodden, and I think that's admirable. However, when he's stepping into global warming issues, environmental issues, issues of science, issue of public policy application, his moral authority, his special insight that he has as Pope is not so powerful, and I think he is susceptible to being misled or not understanding what the consequences would be. So the Pope, speaking about global warming in particular, for example, one of his greatest concerns, he says, is extreme weather events. As the objective data show, just about every type of extreme weather event that you can imagine, hurricanes, tornadoes, droughts, etc., have become less frequent and less severe as our planet modestly warms. So it's one thing to buy into what people are telling you that are selling a particular agenda, but the facts tell us something different. And then touching in with regulatory issues and the EPA. The EPA and Pope Francis's advisors are in lockstep looking to impose restrictions on energy use, restrictions that are going to take a real toll. One of the greatest factors in terms of health and life expectancy is wealth. And if you impose expensive energy sources on people, you are going to be reducing lifespans. You are going to make it less possible for people to purchase health care, education, nutrition, etc. So I think it's very important to make sure that first and foremost that we have a strong economy which is dependent upon affordable, abundant energy. And that's what we should be pushing for.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, so one of the interesting things I think is you listen to Pope Francis talk about on energy is the cover that then is given to those that would increase regulations on things like energy because of the moral authority he brings to the subject. And that's problematic in any sort of system where regulations manage to get the imprimatur of moralism linked to them, and that's certainly something I think that's happening. One of the major concerns is that there's actually a lesson about wealth that we learn in terms of the environmental outcomes, and that is as wealth increases, so do environmental outcomes as individuals are able to actually make decisions about the world around them rather than the survival instincts that they all have. And so if you want to end up with a much better environment, increasing wealth through capitalism leads down that path much faster than a centrally organized or planned regulatory state. And so the more you hear an anti-capitalist message from those with moral authority, the tougher it is to get down that path.
Well, good afternoon, and thank you for having me here today. I have not had the opportunity to listen to the Pope's discussion yesterday before Congress, but obviously he said something to my Speaker Boehner, and we're doing with the decision that he has made, with all due respect. But and right now the topic in Ohio, which is, as all of you are aware of, is a very, very electoral state. I mean, the politics are very, very strong there, but we are dealing with some very hard regulatory issues right now with 111D, which is the Clean Power Plant agreement in a district that I represent that is heavily coal-oriented, but also has the fracking issues. So, I'm as far as the Pope speaking out on climate change, I wish the Pope would focus on things and issues that he has say over, what he can take over, and I respect his humanity efforts. But for him to come into different sectors of this, of global warming, I don't know. I think he should have a better target that he should go with.
Thank you. I think one of the things that was just mentioned, and you mentioned the CPP, the Clean Power Plan, and the issues of the federal government, the EPA coming down on some pretty stringent position on this particular thing. North Dakota, where I'm from, we got a hard hit on this. Initially, when this plan had come out, North Dakota wasn't going to even see a 10% change. And then all of a sudden, when they revised it, and without warning and without ability to even propose anything or comment, they came out with this change on the final days, and they moved it to a 47% effect in North Dakota, closing down 5 power plants. If you'd understand how North Dakota and that is, that's everything. And so Minnesota's going to get really, really cold. Because without our coal, they don't have power. So with that type of thing, this type of over-regulation, overstepping of boundaries by the federal government is very important. One of the things I think that connects with this that I want to hear some discussion on is the renewable power standards or renewable energy standards that certain states are implementing upon themselves. I don't have a problem with states' rights. That's what I've been pushing for a long, long time. But what happens when this state here tries to impose those types of things and the state that they're getting the power from, and those start to clash? And I think that's an important discussion. Minnesota and North Dakota had that discussion in the court system. And so I'll move on to you guys on that type of thing.
Well, I'll be happy to start. One thing that's really interesting over the past several years, when I would meet with policymakers in various states, when the renewable power mandates were in vogue, I would point out how expensive solar power, wind power is compared to conventional power. And they would say, well, Mr. Taylor, that's all well and good, but we're going to have to make these changes anyway. It's better to start off right now, and we can already be halfway there when the feds impose it, so it won't hurt our citizens so much. And my response was, don't trust the federal government to give you any type of credit for this. And you're seeing this play out right now, for example, in Michigan, where you have the governor and the attorney general on different sides of the issue as to whether they want to just implement the Clean Power Plan themselves, as the governor's saying, or the attorney general says, no, let's fight it. But what happens is even the governor's top energy advisor says, well, one of the problems is more than half of the renewable power programs, the efforts that we've made, are not being credited to us by EPA under their plan. In Florida, when I was meeting with, it's really unusual. It's the agriculture commissioner who oversees the executive energy policy. So Ag Commissioner Adam Putnam, when he was trying to shut down coal and even to a certain extent natural gas for more solar power, he said the same thing. It's coming down the pipe from the feds. We might as well get on board now. And what happened? Well, it's not being credited to Florida either. So a couple things to take from this. Number one, don't always think that the federal government, in fact, be very careful of thinking the federal government is going to reward you for doing quote-unquote good things that are coming at the expense of your citizens' wallets. Because what they consider to be the good things, they're not going to give you credit for it. They haven't empirically. And second, there's a battle going out, like I mentioned in Michigan. Even for folks who understand that the carbon dioxide restrictions of the Clean Power Plan are totally unnecessary and ineffective. Still, there are folks who say it's better that we do it ourselves so that Washington bureaucrats aren't crafting it. And then there are folks who are saying, well, you know what, once we do it ourselves, we own it. And I think that's something that, from my perspective, I would advise, and maybe there's different opinions on this, let the Washington bureaucrats own it, let them fight it, let them defend it, and probably most important of all, let them expend their resources developing it, implementing it. Because when the states do it themselves, that means you have all this dead time on the payroll and on the clocks of EPA that they have to justify for their budgets. And if they're not doing it by implementing the Clean Power Plan, they're going to be looking for something else. So there's a lot of issues there, and the renewable power fits in. Betty, you brought that up. The states that have enacted renewable power mandates, their electricity prices have gone up twice as fast as the rest of the nation. Twice as fast since 2008. That's pretty much when all but 2 of the states with renewable power mandates implemented their plan. Those are real-world costs. It's costing, on average, the average household in those states approximately $500 per family per year. I mean, think about that, $500 per family per year. If that money were returned to the people, the economies in those states would be growing much more rapidly. Their standard of living would be improving. That's something you want to fight for.
Yeah, so it's interesting. One of the things we've been working on at Strata with Utah State University is actually a hard look at what do renewable portfolio standards in the states do. Because as terrible as policy the feds make can be, and it can be very terrible, that doesn't mean that just because a state's made a policy, it ends up being any better. In fact, we see a whole bunch of these negative things coming from RPS standards that were state initiatives. And as we've dug around across the states that have implemented, there's substantial costs that go beyond just the electricity stuff that was talked about. There's also macroeconomic impacts as you change the dynamic of the energy market and raise particularly industrial energy costs. You see a movement in a number of sectors that actually cost jobs and decreases the growth in per capita income. And so those sorts of costs ought to be thought about as we try to discuss what was seemingly, especially if you read the sort of discussions in '08, there was a lot of kumbaya moments about let's just declare that we're all going to end up as renewable power users. Well, kumbaya moments in politics are never actually kumbaya moments. They always come with this nasty thing at the end where you have to pay the costs. And this, I think, ties really well in with the Clean Power Plan and 111D regulations. We met a couple of weeks ago with folks from Utah in our governor's office, and they suffer from the notion that they're going to create the plan and they're going to get out ahead of it and it's going to go far better. Well, what there was no ever discussion with is what's the cost of actually putting together that plan, designing the implementation in Utah, going to really look like. And they haven't had any real sense of what that's going to be. Hopefully, we'll be able to work with them to say, hey, you ought to think about this before you run headlong down this path on a plan that may or may not be acceptable to the EPA. You may still end up with an EPA-directed plan.
And Ryan came, it's funny in Ohio right now, next September 30th, next Wednesday, we have a report due on our renewable portfolio standards. And last General Assembly, I introduced a bill, Senate Bill 310, which was to go back and reevaluate our standards and to see what it was actually costing our consumers, our constituents, and the customers that Ohio is obviously a very major industrial state, and our energy costs are very high. So my study, and as I said, Ryan came this year and testified before the study committee that we put together, and our report is due on Wednesday. I cannot disclose what the findings will be until Wednesday, but this freeze, we got a lot of negative feedback from putting these things on hold. In '08, James said he was there in Ohio. I had just gotten to the legislature at that time, but in '08, we didn't have this thing called natural gas, the abundance that we have right now. We didn't have the hydraulic fracturing that was going on right now that we have now. So in a business climate, and this is kind of where I've stood on the whole thing. I mean, they say you can't change this, you can't change it, you got to keep on going down this path. But, look, business people change the path. We have to accommodate and adapt. And there are changes that have to be made. So there's been drastic changes from '08 to 2015 now. So we have looked very hard at this. We were actually the second state last General Assembly to implement a freeze. There are now states outside of Ohio that I'm sure, I thought I heard somebody from Kansas here. Kansas has just done it. I know Michigan is, they're not doing it yet, but several other states are either eliminating their mandates or putting them on hold right now. So it's an important play right now just because of 111D and what is happening with that and the uncertainty that plays.
And if I can just add a couple points here. The tangible impact in Ohio, for example, the senator noted that the prices. In Ohio, since implementing their renewable power mandates, their electricity prices have gone up triple the national average. Nationally, it's twice as fast. In Ohio, 3 times as fast. Ohio is not particularly well suited for solar power or for wind power, but they went ahead anyway because it felt good to do so. Kansas was mentioned. In Kansas, since they implemented their renewable power mandates, their electricity prices have risen 8 times faster than the national average. That not only takes money out of the pockets of consumers, it also puts businesses in the state at a huge competitive disadvantage versus other states, and that's jobs that aren't being created at the same time. So these have real-world impacts, these feel-good measures.
Renewables do not work. Someone said they're from rural area that they represent. I'm in the Appalachia, so when it's rural, I don't know how rural it is, wherever that legislator was from this morning that was talking about the education role. I fall in the same line with you on the education stuff. That's very interesting too. But we're coal. I mean, it is coal, and now it's oil and gas, and it's always been a natural resource. You know, in Ohio, we look, and I know James touched on this when he was there to testify in 2008, but you know, Northwest Ohio is flat and wide open. In my part of southeastern Ohio, it's rolling hills, and some of them are real steep, and the wind doesn't come all the way through, and the sun shines very little. But boy, oh boy, we could keep those wells pumping.
And that calls to mind, if I can
just jump in.
interject again. Oftentimes you'll hear, hey, what about these green jobs? You know, we're having all this wind power jobs, solar jobs, and we're creating this green economy. A couple things to keep in mind. If you are mandating a certain percentage of your power coming from a certain power source, you are not creating any jobs. You are merely shifting jobs by government mandate from one sector of the energy industry to the other sector. You're taking jobs away from natural gas, from coal, et cetera. But that's not it. It gets worse than that for a couple particulars. First of all, because people have to pay higher electricity prices for that expensive wind and solar, it means throughout your entire state economy, you have people having to take money away from their budgets that they otherwise would be spending on nutrition, on health care, on education, on consumer goods. And that means jobs are being destroyed economy-wide because of the money that people now have to spend, the extra money, on the same electricity they were getting anyway. It means in states like Ohio, you're shifting jobs from the eastern part of the state to the western part of the state. But you're not even creating many jobs in the western part of the state. Coal, natural gas power plants, there's a tremendous amount of job creation that goes when you're building those plants and also to maintain the plants. For wind power and solar power, it's basically manufacturing the turbines and the panels. There's very little jobs created. And the jobs that are created, by and large, are being created in Germany and China. Very little of that's manufactured in the United States. The little that is not being manufactured in Ohio. So you have this triple whammy. They say they're creating jobs and growing the green economy. They're doing nothing of the sort. They're raising energy prices. They're destroying jobs in conventional energy. They're destroying jobs across the board. And the few jobs that they can point to aren't even American jobs or state-specific jobs.
Yeah, and actually it gets even a little worse than sort of those. There's a fourth point that is you start to talk to folks that are experts in electrical grid network design and maintenance, that as you increase the requirement to have renewables entering into the network, you reduce the reliability of the overall network because of intermittent generation from either wind, which only works when the wind is actually blowing, or solar, which only works on days with good insulation. And in order to actually have that, you have to build an entire backup system to cover what that will be, because wind and solar are not what we call baseload generators. They're not what keep things running. They only run when the geographic conditions are exactly right. And if you need that power, if you need those megawatts from those farms, you're going to have a backup system in place. And so you end up spending twice to have the same size of network you would normally need. Germany in particular has seen this. To go to all renewables, it's actually not possible. You can't get there because you still have to have the backup system in place in order to actually build it out.
And that was one of the things I was kind of noting, just in case it didn't get brought up, was that consistency of the power. And And in wind aspects, they always had said, well, North Dakota, gee, that's the Saudi Arabia of wind, you know. and I don't remember, somebody here was joking with me, asking me that since North Dakota had this surplus of money, did we plant our second tree? You know, and so we are known for a little bit of this wind. And so with that, that's all fine and good, but it can't blow too fast and it can't blow too slow. So it's not going, those windmills are not going all the time. And you know, the worst type, when we want the most power is during a snowstorm. Those solar panels are not working in the snowstorm. And so I think that consistency level is very, very important, because for efficient, low-cost power on a grid that's coming from coal, you can't power up and power down your coal plants on the basis of how much wind or how much sun is going on. And I think that was something that just really, really needed to be pointed out, and I appreciate you bringing that up. The other thing that I think is important was initially on some of these CPP talks on 111D, they talked about, well, coal can be converted over to nat gas, and we'll start using natural gas. That'll be our green. Well, now they're moving away. They're saying, oh, nat gas that's not going to count. That's not clean enough. That has fracking to it, so we're not going to count that anymore either. It's got to be something else. And by the way, we already eliminated nuclear. So, you know, it's very specific. They want those two forms of power, and it has to be wind and it has to be solar, and those types of things are very interesting and need to be continuously brought up so that the people understand what's being forced upon us.
Let's talk about wind for just one second, because even the wind industry's own sort of lobbyists, OEA, which is sort of their trade group, their most optimistic claim about a wind farm, I hate that term, it should be called a wind facility, because they're not a farm regardless of what they may call them. They're talking about 30% generation capacity, so 30% of what is possible if it ran all the time. So a third of the time, they're talking of being the maximum generation. Reality, it's under 20%, even for the best farms. But they're talking about something that only has a 30% capacity rating in terms of generation. And that's their own folks talking about this. And every time I've listened to discussions, those that are advocating for it never talk about the fact that you have to dramatically overbuild in order to get anywhere near the actual capacity that you need from a wind facility if, in fact, you're going to use it to power.
And Betty, when they say that North Dakota is the Saudi Arabia for wind power, everywhere I go, everyone claims they're the Saudi Arabia of this or the Saudi Arabia of that. Let me tell you what we are the Saudi Arabia of, or for better term, the America of. When you look at the three most important, significant conventional power sources, or really just power sources across the board, they happen to be conventional: coal, oil, natural gas. That's what powers the economies of the world. People don't realize this. We behave as an energy-poor country not because we lack the resources, but because of foolish political decisions. We have more coal, oil, and natural gas than every other nation on the planet, including Saudi Arabia. In fact, there's only one other nation that has as much as half as much coal, oil, and natural gas as us. That's Russia. Only one. Yeah. Only one. So when folks say we're the Saudi Arabia of this or the Saudi Arabia of that, I'd rather be the Saudi Arabia of what matters, of what powers the world. And I lived the past 20 years in Florida. I just moved to Chicago this year. So we'd always get, well, you know, we're the Sunshine State, so we should be leading the world in solar panels and solar production. First of all, that's garbage because it's very cloudy in Florida sometimes. We're actually only about average. But let's say for the sake of argument that our state motto, the Sunshine State, were true. Even that wouldn't matter, even if North Dakota was the Saudi Arabia of wind power. And I'm going to give you an example. I've been to New York a few times in the last few years. I can tell you from personal experience that Manhattan is indeed the rat capital of the world. I mean, you go out at night, they're there, they're big, they're aggressive, they're everywhere. And you know what? We have the technical capacity. We know how. We can put little electrical wires on them, put them on little treadmills, have them running around, and we can generate power. The fact that we know how to do it doesn't mean it's going to make sense even in the rat capital of the world. Because the power they generate is very diffuse, it's very minimal, you have to feed them, all that stuff. The same applies to wind and solar power. The reason why you don't have much of it unless you have mandates, is because the wind and the sun, their power is very diffuse. It's not concentrated like in coal or oil or natural gas. It's right there in one rock. It's right there in the oil itself. Just because a place is the Saudi Arabia of this or that doesn't make a bit of difference in terms of whether you want to use it for electricity.
Yeah,
Good point.
You couple all that together with the fact that because we mandate and then we subsidize things that are already existing in the renewable sector, it means we'll never get the rat-generated power, even if it was a better idea than it actually is. Because the subsidies and the regulations that are put on basically mean that we're going to continue to bet on wind and solar, which we've been doing since the 1970s, well into the future, even though we haven't seen dramatic changes in their ability to produce. And so all the capital goes there, and the folks with the crazy idea for renewables never have a chance to enter into the market and actually see what can happen. And I don't know about the rest of you, but the more talk I hear about the startup protections that wind and solar need, it's been 40 years. We're no longer at startup mode. It's either got to work in the market or it's got to go away.
And I think that if the time ever comes, I don't think it's going to happen in my lifetime or ever because wind and solar power are so diffuse. But let's say for the sake of argument, the time comes when wind or solar power are cost competitive. I'll cheerlead them like nobody else's business. It's not a matter of being pro this or anti that, other than being pro affordable, abundant energy and anti-government impositions in the marketplace that make energy more expensive and less reliable. That's what's going to damage our economy. That's what's going to have human health and welfare factors across the board because the price of everything is going up. But we should be an all of the above energy country in the sense of all of the above should have the same opportunity to compete in a free market, and if the technology is superior, it will prevail. Not in all of the above getting a certain carved out percentage share, not all of the above getting certain subsidies. All of the above should have an opportunity to compete. And I'll cheerlead anybody that's competing under those conditions, and I hope they succeed.
And in an all-the-above approach like that, it means that some things will leave the marketplace just like they should. And that's the real answer to all of the above. It's not keeping things that don't work. It's actually letting the market determine and sort out what makes sense and what doesn't.
Well, what I'm kind of hearing right now is one, capitalism and letting it work. But the other thing is that we brought up natural gas. And what the abundance of natural gas in the United States right now came from one source right now, and that was the hydraulic fracking. And I had a campaign that I was running about 4 years ago, and the theme actually out of it came, and it was Frack Baby Frack. So just kind of saying where we come from in North Dakota and how important that is, as much as, this discussion has shown that the federal government would like to just shut down all of those activities. It's not going to be that way, at least we hope. But part of the problem is the federal government is playing games with right now the economies down the Midwest, from North Dakota down to Texas, and that is that they are failing to move on removing the ban on exports for crude. And some people don't understand why that is so important, and I'll give a little input on that, in that the federal government stopping us from being able to play in the world market is very important. Well, some would say, well, hey, we want to keep a hold of that. That's our energy. We want to have it. We want to use the crude. Yes. The issue is, though, that if every bit of our pricing is done on the world market, yet we're not able to participate in the world market, and it's causing a great consternation with availability, marketing, and how that goes. Great that gas prices are low. Don't get me wrong on this, because it's going to sound like I'm contradicting myself in that I want to see gas prices go up. No, but understand that if we have this artificial holding down of gas prices and for the marketplace for the use of crude and the ability for us to get it out of the ground, it's causing this turnaround. Now, on top of all of that, our current administration has cut this great deal with Iran. And if this thing gets moving and goes into effect, not only will we be subsidizing this country, they're going to flood the market, and we are still in the inability to be a part of and a participant in this market. And so on that idea of the export issues, and if anybody wants to jump in on part of the Jones Act on some of that, I think the Jones Act needs to be addressed a little bit on top of that same thing, just because our manufacturers utilize that and need that type of thing and that type of protection and ability to use that. But we are able to export on our nat gas. We're not able to export on crude. How do you think we can go about that, and do you see any kind of movement on it? What are you seeing on the effects of that? I know that it has a great effect on the economy. I've been hearing it from a lot of the states. North Dakota, who was sitting in an abundance in the appropriations and budgetary, we're right now at a 4% deficit, and we're looking at probably having to readjust a budget, of which we had already cut the budget way, way back this last session. So how do you enter into conversation on that?
Well, I'll start by saying, first of all, I would encourage people that there's tremendous power in language and the use of words. So when we talk about capitalism, so many people have been trained to think that's a horrible thing. It's not. But I would use the term economic freedom, and that's what capitalism is. And who's against freedom? So I would say, first of all, I'd make sure that I say I'm for economic freedom. I want an economy that's based on economic freedom. In terms of exports, this really goes to show what happens, how you screw up something a little bit in the beginning, and it's going to keep screwing things up for decades. Because with the ban on exports, now you had refineries that were built here that were dependent upon that ban, the outlaying the capital and all that, and now when you take it off and you return free markets to the economy, now the people that ended up getting hosed by or going to get hosed by it, yeah, we should have free markets, but it shows you in the first place to be wary of these experiments in protectionism that work against free markets in the first place. And I would say, just as a side note, what I think would have an even greater impact would be to make sure that we allow more oil and natural gas production on federal lands. It's taken a tremendous downturn during the Obama administration. The fact that oil prices are so low today, gas prices are so low today, are primarily due to the fracking revolution and the increase in U.S. oil production as a result. That's happening even though we basically can't produce on federal lands. It's happening entirely on private lands and state lands. If we were to allow production, just reasonable production with reasonable environmental restrictions, we would have even more oil flooding into the market, which would be reducing prices even more. So that would have the greatest impact of everything as far as I'm concerned.
Go ahead.
No, so one of the issues with the export ban is that it was an emotional response to a crisis, and just like when I make my own decisions, I try not to allow myself to make decisions when I'm angry, because that's a recipe for lots of bad things to happen. You can ask the folks I work with. Every terrible decision that I've made is usually because I was upset about something, and the export ban is very similar. And it'll be an interesting fight continuing to go forward, because there are now entrenched interests that it developed as a result of putting that protectionism in place, and it'll hurt if it's lifted for those folks. But it's not a question of saying, okay, well, it's going to hurt, so we should continue to do it and continue to have the negatives. Sometimes the medicine the medicine does hurt. And as we talk about federal lands in particular, one of the most interesting things over the last about 6 years has been this discussion of the skyrocketing production of energy in the United States. And if you listen to those inside the current administration, they've somehow managed to take credit for that. They're very happy that there's this increased energy production, while at the same time essentially have ended new exploration on federal lands. And so it's not just by chance that this is happening primarily in states with smaller amounts of federal lands, like North Dakota, than states with large tracts of federal lands, like Utah, for example. Getting new permits, and particularly permits that have to involve fracking, is essentially impossible at this point, unless they're in already established well fields. And so new exploration has basically ground to a halt on federally owned lands, where a whole bunch of the reserves currently sit. So there are additional reserves that could be tapped into. There's just a regulatory environment that prevents it.
The lift, I'm more encouraged about it every day. I mean, I was on the phone with somebody this morning, even from the federal side of it. In Ohio, I just introduced my second hearing next week for a resolution to encourage Congress to lift the ban. And in my conversation with them this morning, they had reached out to talking to several federal congressional men and women and saying that, they're getting some very positive feedback from both sides. So I don't want to be the bearer of bad news, but I think with the attention that this has been getting, you're seeing a lot more press about this in the last couple of months, and it's something that's pretty easy to do, and it's something that can be adapted by everybody, and that everybody can probably agree to.
Absolutely, and I think it is moving well. Right now, Congress is having the discussions. They're having some great hearings. I think it's passed out of one of the committees in the House, and they're looking at taking that up on the floor, and that is all fine and good. The only problem I have is the administration recently came out and said, and by the way, I don't want the export ban lifted. So, we just, it's the concern of what's going to happen with the administration on this. Hopefully, there will be a strong backbone in Congress to have the numbers available and ready on the votes to just go past the administration on this. We are going to take up your questions. Everybody ready? And we have Logan up here with the mic. Raise your hand, and she's going to start.
Also, there is more coffee in the back. Just FYI. Sorry, we ran out, but there's more.
What did she say?
Hi, Representative Gary Glenn from Michigan. I'm Vice Chairman of the House Energy Committee. And Troy, I want to ask you for a firsthand report because this is a hot issue right now in Michigan. We had an open market like Ohio up until 2008, and the utilities said, unless you give us a substantial guaranteed market share, then we can't invest in new plants that we won't get return on investment for 30 years. So the legislature gave them a 90% guarantee of the market. 10% could choose from alternative energy suppliers. Now they're coming back to us having not built any new plants since they got 90%, saying we got to have 100%.
Has this exact issue.
Right across our border is Ohio, where you have an open market, as I understand it. They got to compete for every piece of market share they get. We have no new plants in Michigan in the last several decades, except by one independent power producer. But the Akron paper, the Cleveland Plain Dealer report that right now you've got 6 plants in the process of being constructed that are expected to be online in 2019, and there's no guarantee of market share. So and your rates are lower than Michigan's. Mm-hmm. So it's like we're in two different worlds. I mean, they just cross the border and make this argument right across the border. Your experience seems to suggest that everything they're telling us is just, in fact, Detroit Edison, who says they won't build any plants in Michigan without a guarantee of the market, is building a plant in Ohio where they got no guarantee. So am I missing something? The utilities like to quote Governor Kasich. They have some quote from him saying, going to an open market in electricity may not have been the smartest thing Ohio ever did, or something like that. So what do you think?
All right, first of all, we had the first national championship also, the #1 at Ohio State next to Michigan. So just to do that for you, Mr. Glenn. Mr. Case.
Lansing in about a month.
As I told you, the coaches from my hometown went to school with it. Governor Kasich did make that statement. Actually, about the same time we were doing it in Senate Bill 310. I'm looking at Ron just because Ron has just been there in Ohio most recently. So I don't mean nothing. We don't have a little thing going on here as far as making deals, but so that was one statement. The PUCO is dealing with some of those issues right now, where the utilities want a little bit more of the guarantee of return on investment. I think a lot of my fellow colleagues struggle with that issue. It's tough, and there are plants being built right now, but that uncertainty is still there. There's also 2 plants actually in my district that this sold their share ownership to a company out of Texas called Dynegy. So, I think the investor-owned utilities have to make a decision whether or not that they're going to start, and this is kind of what I know, I'm not speaking of the PJM, but of that market, but this is where you come into play where are we going to continue to want to do business and get a 12% return on our investment, or are we going to come back down to a level of 6%? We'll put that number out there. So the AEP, I know when you say Akron and Cleveland Plain Dealer, I know exactly what utility company you're dealing with. I guess I shouldn't mention that name. But we will not be going back to that statement that Governor Kasich made in the near future. And I think with these case studies going on right now, actually before the PUCO, they came out with a ruling last week. And part of the plan was to extend it to a 15-year return back. The PUCO has suggested maybe you look at it to a 3-year. So the PUCO gave out their recommendations for this. It's different than what the utilities requested, though.
Hello. Representative Kim Koppelman from North Dakota, home of the 4-time consecutive national champion North Dakota State University Bison football team.
Go Sioux.
FCS
Go
champions.
Sioux.
Uh-oh. I want to first greet my longtime colleague and good friend, Representative Grandy. I still call her Representative Grandy. Good to see you. And whenever I see James Taylor, I ask him when he's going to sing, but you got to be old enough to get that. So, speaking of which, I have a bumper sticker for you. Peter, Paul, and Mary were wrong. The answer is not blowing in the wind. How's that? Just a couple things. You've done a great job of hitting on a lot of issues, the panel has, and a couple thoughts, and then I'd like your comment. One is, I'm always intrigued by how the same environmentalist extremists who advocate nothing but wind and solar power never talk about all the birds that are killed by wind turbines and some of the other issues. They conveniently ignore some of that. And secondly, I really believe that the answer to a lot of these issues, whether it's the decision we talked about, Representative Grandy talked about the disagreement North Dakota had with Minnesota about importing coal-fired energy. And the states really need, I think, to work together to resolve these issues. Washington, D.C. isn't going to do it. If our country's going to get fixed, whether you're talking about energy or a lot of the other issues, I think the answers are going to have to come from the states. There is an interstate compact available for interstate siting of power lines, by the way. So if you have issues with that, transporting energy across the border of your states, that is out there and available. I can help you with information on that if you're interested. I want to tell you a quick story and then get your reaction. Most people, being from North Dakota, when we go around the country, I'm sure Betty has experienced the same thing. Most people say, well, sure, your state's in good shape. Of course you've got money, you've got oil, good for you. And we wish we had the oil you have. What they don't realize is that public policy had a lot to do with that. And I learned that really backwards because I was sitting in a meeting of a group of congressmen who came to North Dakota about 2 years ago to try to figure out what we're doing right and what's going on with the oil boom and so on. I was sitting next to the chief engineer for the largest oil company in the Bakken, where our oil fields are. And I was asking him a lot of scientific questions about fracking. And he stopped for a moment and he said, how long have you been in the legislature? I said, well, I was elected in 1994. He said, do you remember the 95 session? I said, yeah, it was my first session. Well, he said, let me tell you a story. He said, the way we do fracking today, fracking itself has been around for quite a while, but the way we do it today was kind of my idea. He said, we had this idea, our company did, of how we might be able to extract oil out of this shale rock. We didn't know if it would work. It had never been tried before, and we couldn't afford to try the way your tax structure was. So we came to the North Dakota legislature, and we asked you if you would change your oil tax. He said, you remember what you did? I said, well, I remember we tweaked it a little bit. He said, well, we came to you and said, would you change your oil tax structure just a little bit to allow us to experiment with this? And the next words out of his mouth are forever seared in my brain. He said, you said yes. And if it were not for the fact that North Dakota has a business-friendly legislature, there would be no Bakken oil boom.
I want to answer your question as far as bringing an outside energy source in Ohio, and what we've learned through the testimony that we've heard with the study committee is 25%, and which I knew it prior, but 25% of our energy comes from outside. So Ohio does import energy into the state.
Yeah, so I'm not at all surprised to hear you comment on sort of the regulatory side, setting up the boom. We've been working in a project that involves the 13 western states and tracking all of all the regulations we could find that tie into the energy production sector. And it wasn't a terrible shock to me, it was to some of the students we work with closely, that the places that were having relative booms, you could actually see a vast difference in the way in which they regulated and the size and scope. So it's not that it's just the Wild West in North Dakota, it's that the regulations are set up in such a way that they're able to actually operate under them rather than heavy restrictions on them. And so that approach, I think, actually is sort of what drives a whole bunch of what's going on in North Dakota. It's also true of Wyoming. And if you want the counterexample, you can look at California. Even in their renewables, which they have a public policy position for, their entire regulatory structure is set up to make it very difficult to go. And as far as birds and bats, and I would add turtles into that for solar, no, there is a serious problem. They're so serious, in fact, that the proponents, especially of wind, went out to get an incidental take permit for 30 years to allow them to take endangered species. A court just struck that down as saying that's probably unreasonable, so there'll be more litigation. But it's a real concern, and it's a concern that was big enough that they went and fought for basically a categorical exemption from the Endangered Species Act.
And I'll touch on the first point also in terms of the bird and bat kills. The number is 1.5 million each and every year, birds and bats, including many endangered species, protected species, golden eagles, bald eagles, etc., are killed by wind turbines. That's with wind producing only 3% of our electricity. If we were to get anywhere near to 30% and we're no longer cherry picking the most efficient places, you're going to have not just 10 times, probably 20 times that number, 30 million killed each year, including many protected and endangered species. By comparison, if a half a dozen birds are found having drowned in an oil, water, pit, whatever, the fines are in the millions. The wind companies can do it for free. Also by comparison, if you remember the BP Gulf oil spill, that very week President Obama goes on television and says, this is why we need more wind power. Well, okay, first of all, oil and wind power, they're different. They're electricity and transportation. But let's assume they weren't apples and oranges. Okay, according to the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, official numbers, you add up all of the marine birds, marine mammals, marine reptiles killed by the BP Gulf oil spill. The number was 6,500, give or take 200. I forget the exact number. 6,500 for a once-in-a-generation spill. And his solution is 1.5 million kills each and every year, and he wants to amplify that, multiply that times 10. So it's easy to point out there's no such thing as an entirely benign, environmentally benign energy source. We should be producing energy and using it responsibly, environmentally responsibly, but the so-called alternatives, wind power, solar power, in my opinion, are much worse.
I want to touch on a little bit too as far as what you've done in the legislature, and obviously Ohio uses North Dakota as examples. I say that very sternly, I mean we have. So in Ohio, with this administration and the legislature, it's been both of us. We've implemented some really good regulatory issues. We've made some changes. We've made some tax structure changes, and it's played a major impact. So when we go back to the jobs and the economy as far as whether it's renewables or not, so a county that I represent 4 years ago had an unemployment rate of 15.1. As of 3 weeks ago, it was 5. So that's the magnitude that this development has encouraged for the state of Ohio. Obviously, the whole state of Ohio unemployment now is down to 4%, 4.7, I believe is the exact number. But most of that upspring has come from the oil and gas industry on the eastern portion of that. And that brings into the whole education side of it. We don't have employees. We don't have, we don't have kids getting involved in the vocational programs that we need and welding. And we have, business owners now that are taking on their own responsibility. Look, if these kids can't get trained at the high school, then we're going to bring them out of the vocational programs and implement our own. So pretty impressive things that are going on in Ohio. And I want those to be some of the positives. I mean, we talk about some of the negative stuff that's going on with renewable and bats and birds and what else? Turtles.
Turtles.
Desert tortoises.
It's just, it's encouraging. And I can speak for the people of Ohio and the people that I represent. It's the greatest of times right now, and they are so encouraged by what's happening, and we are lifting them up, and things are going great.
And I think that's a very good point. And I think what's important with this whole energy discussion is there's a couple of things that can be pointed out. The states that have weathered the storm the best are the ones that embraced energy development. And part of that is North Dakota was fortunate enough to have the first greenfield diesel plant put up and is running at full capacity in 40 years in the United States. We don't see plants like that going and being put up, but we have the first one that ever made it. We have a couple others that would like to go online, but we go back to the export issue. They can't do and make the profits they need to right now because they cannot utilize that export portion, and we're having a problem with the capacity issues there. The other thing that North Dakota is trying to move to, and that's all this secondary business. It's what else can energy do besides the production of getting it out of the ground? What else can we do? We're looking at putting fertilizer plants together. We're looking at, all the other secondary that can come with it. And then before we go to the next question, do you have somebody ready? I have with me just a limited number of these little bumper stickers that one of the Bakken companies gave me, and I thought they were kind of cute. So if anybody wants one, but they just says oil, 100% organic energy. And I thought they were kind of cute, so he handed me a packet before I got here. So go ahead to the next question, please.
Thank you, Ed Emery from Missouri Senate. I guess it still grieves me somewhat that we have somehow allowed CO2, a natural product of life, to become a pollutant. But given that we have, I was in a meeting recently with our Missouri Department of Natural Resources where they were going over some of the requirements that we're going to have to live up to with 111D, and someone ran some numbers in the room and calculated that we could meet those reductions completely if we could just get Americans to take 3 less breaths a year. And I'm wondering if if anybody's working on that, a simple government mandate would solve this.
No, I'm not working on that, and I don't think I will. And something you said by speaking to your natural resources, and I want to say, all of you that are in the legislature and even not in the legislature, we speak ill of bigger government, we frown upon it. But I'm going to sit here and tell you that Ohio is in a very good place with the EPA director there. He is on top of it. He went and testified 2 weeks ago before Congress against how this is going to hurt Ohio and the surrounding states of Kentucky, West Virginia, and you all know what's happening in West Virginia with the political market and the political changes going on there, but also Pennsylvania. So I would encourage you, I don't know how many of you have relationship or even have the EPA director or the accessibility to it, but it's important that you have an EPA director who's taking the lead for us and who I am working with directly that is there fighting for it and understanding the cause. Our PUC, our Public Utilities Commission, which is non-elected. I also have a gentleman there that's as one of the commissioners there. I want to express how involved he has been. He's gone to Washington several times. The guy's a genius at this thing. And it's important for us as legislators to have those friends working with us. Now I can maybe talk, so the director, Butler, and I are both avid runners, big runners. So we'll talk to people about taking a couple of less breaths, and getting in shape. But
We could ban jogging, we'd solve it.
No, we don't want to do that. We need jogging to clear our minds after we deal with what we have to deal with on a daily basis. So
We have time for one last
One
question
last
from
question.
Senator Russ.
I'm so sorry, I didn't want to be the last one, but I want to tell you, Todd Russ from Oklahoma, and being in the legislature and also being in private business for about 30 years, this panel has been wonderful, and we certainly are kind and concerned about energy in Oklahoma. I would say, as conservatives, one of the things in business I always had to think and tell myself was to know my customer. As members of the legislature in the political landscape and as conservatives, one of the worst things we do, I believe, is remind our constituents that we care about our environment. I mean, we're always fighting with these environmentalists, and believe me, I'm at the front of the fight when it comes to that. But it's not because that we don't care about the environment. We really care about the environment. We just use a different philosophy and a different discretion on the pace we take to do that and how we behave in getting into that process. So educating them, tell them, when they say you don't care about the environment, we need to tell them we do care about the environment. We should have said that first, and we also need to tell the public about it's not that their first impression, why don't you want clean air and clean water? The argument is it's not about clean air and clean water. It's about crashing our economy. They don't have a clue about the economic impacts of it. I mean, it doesn't even register. And when you say, well, do you want your utility rates to go up 3, 4, 5, 8 times? Well, now, where does that come from? Well, it comes from all these and so maybe as we go out to our other states across the nation, we can help that dialogue be pushed a different direction than we just, the conservatives, don't care about the economy, the environment, and maybe focus on the economy and the environment. for us.
Yeah, I actually think there are two great messages there, one of which is the state of the U.S. environment is actually incredibly good. If you look at most of the indicators, even EPA's own air quality indicators, although they just changed their methodology again to make it even less clear what on earth they're doing, the track has been up on almost all the key indicators across all the environments. So the story there is great. And then on top of that, the trend lines all start well before we move into the regulatory era in the mid-70s. So the track, as the United States has gotten wealthier, has once again been towards cleaner environment and better environmental outcomes, a cleaner environment, and you don't even see a curve. There's no twist in the line when things like the Clean Air Act went into force. The trend line continues without a significant change.
Yeah, and the numbers from EPA, the 6 principal pollutants, the ones they're most concerned about, since 1980, according to EPA, those have declined by 70%. So it's not like we're fighting an air quality crisis. Our air is remarkably clean. But when you talk about fighting the environmental activist groups, we're all environmentalists, I hope, but there's a difference between an environmentalist and an environmental activist group. And these groups are beholden to the large renewable power companies that fund them. And let me give you an example. If you talk about the same 6 principal pollutants that EPA tracks, if you look at coal versus natural gas reduces those pollutants by greater than 90%. Why aren't the environmental activist groups in favor of natural gas? Because they're beholden to the wind and solar power industry. Similarly, and by the way, I don't want to make it seem like coal is that dirty, because coal, with all the technological advances, they've reduced their emissions dramatically also. But also compare wind power to hydropower. The environmental activist groups are so vociferously opposed to hydropower. But what's the difference in environmental impact? They're similar in kind, but wind power is much worse. The assertion against hydropower, it's twofold. Number one is that you're changing the landscape, the run of the rivers and streams, and creating a lake. 2 is that you're somewhat impeding fish migrations and fish travel routes. Although with latter technologies, it's not that much. It's not even that big a deal. But compared to wind power, according to the American Wind Energy Association's own numbers, it requires developing 600 square miles of land to replace a single conventional power plant. There's no dam in the world that displaces 600 square miles of land. At the same time, as I mentioned, wind turbines, even while producing only 3% of our electricity, kill 1.5 million birds and bats each year. That number of fish are not being impacted, let alone killed, by hydropower. So why do environmental activist groups oppose wind power and oppose hydro and support wind power? It's because who they're beholden to and who their big funders are. So that's a fantastic point we should keep in mind. You can be pro-affordable energy, pro-abundant energy, and pro-environment at the same time, and hopefully we all are.
Well, thank you all very much for participating on this panel. It was great. Appreciate it. I think some of the takeaway that I think is one, it's always best that we be informed, and this is one way for everybody to do that. I think another thing that I was hearing repeatedly is remember, this is a kind of a war on words, and we have to use the right words when we're in those discussions, and I think that was pointed out by the people, you and from the people up here, is just making sure you're using the right words and knowing what you're going to talk about. One area we didn't talk about that I think you need to keep your ear to the ground on for another federal regulation is the waters of the U.S. The lawsuits are still going on. North Dakota was fortunate enough to win on this last go-around, but it's only a small win. That doesn't mean it can't be overruled and moved on. And so all of this is all on the table, and it's going to continue. So thank you very much for your interest, for being here today. Come to Heartland for any other information you have, a wealth of knowledge right here. And we have just a tremendous staff dealing with energy and environment issues that are more than willing to help you at each of your state's levels on whatever your interests are. So thank you.